Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you so much for choosing to join us this afternoon for Blurred Lines, Libraries, Bookstores, and Academic Partnerships. My name is Meg White, and my job this afternoon is really simple. I'm going to do a few housekeeping things and then get out of the way and let our panelists talk with you this afternoon. So I'm joined today by three outstanding speakers. They're going to share their perspectives, and then we will open things up for questions. Please do use the chat feature to submit your questions, and we're going to do our best to preserve the end of this session for some interaction with the speakers. So in order of presentation, their full bios are listed on the conference website, but I'll just run down the list and give you their titles. Richard Hirschman, who is Vice President, Government Relations at the National Association of College Stores, will be speaking first. He'll be followed by Jennifer Chan, who is Scholarly Communications Librarian at the UCLA Library. And finally, we will hear from Lisa Noctegal, who is Director, Global Institutional Resellers and Channel Strategy at Oxford University Press. Just as a way of introduction, this topic has been one that the conference committee has been looking at for several years, trying to pull together a session. So it's interesting and ironic, perhaps maybe ironic's not the right word, but in the year of COVID, that this was the year that this panel got put on the agenda and pushed to the front. I think like so many other things in our lives right now, the pandemic has made this discussion even more relevant. So it's very interesting that it's kind of bubbled its way to the surface in a year where it's increasingly relevant to attendees. So thanks so much for joining, and I will pass the baton over to Richard.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me just open up the slides here. All right, well, thank you very much, Meg and my co-presenters. We did include I've included a few items in the file section of the session, so you can also look at those at a later time. With my few minutes, I'm gonna try to kind of frame some of the broader issues going on. And just give you a little bit of background on sort of the course material affordability issue, which is sort of one of the front and center issues when libraries and bookstores collaborate. There's a lot of good news in this space. There's been an incredible amount of efforts over the last dozen or so years addressing the cost of course materials and student access. So what we found is that student spending has declined about 41% since 2007. There's lots of other indicators from the California Student Aid Commission, the National Center for Education Statistics, and other indicators to sort of back up that student spending is declining. The cost of course materials, after increasing very significantly, is starting to moderate. In fact, the Consumer Price Index, which tracks new print textbooks primarily, has dropped the last couple of years, and now is about where it was in 2016, even without adjusting for general inflation. 26% of courses in the four-year publics in Washington State, according to a recent study, have zero textbook costs. And the average purchase price of course materials at four-year public institutions was about $60 for the course. And our Student Watch report found that students were spending about $47 per course. So a lot of these things, when we talk about averages, they don't necessarily tell you the whole picture because of differentiations between courses and course load and subject matters. The cost is all relative to the student's ability to afford the materials and what resources they have, like financial aid. So I just wanted to give you some context. There's a lot of good positive directions in the course material landscape. And you can see that from our Student Watch survey data where the trend has been going. Back in 2007, NACS started having conversations with the library community, the library associations, ACRL and ARL, excuse me, about the need for the communities to get together and spend more time discussing collaboration. And we also increasingly saw that the CIO community, the IT community on campuses were playing a much larger role in licensing of software and educational resources. So it was very important from our view to try to bring these three different groups together. And so that happened back in 2007 in Colorado. There was a conference, and what came out of that was a white paper produced from a colleague of mine, Mark Nelson. It really, I think 13 years later, it's aged very well because these issues still remain very central. So, lots of coming together on issues of digital delivery, but we also are seeing kind of contentious issues with bookstores, libraries, and IT sort of in some ways competing with each other. I really recommend you take a look at that report because I think it still is very applicable to the days we're in. I'm not going to go through all the recommendations, but these were some of the recommendations of the report. I think what you'll see, though, is in the collaboration that is occurring among bookstores and libraries is that some of these issues and recommendations are already underway, particularly the early elements of what we would describe as a unified knowledge portal, where information is being shared and developed from different sources and from different parts of campus, like the bookstore and the libraries. One of the things we've been also convening since that time on mostly an annual basis is the Textbook Affordability Conference, where it's bringing all the major stakeholders to the table, particularly students, faculty, bookstores, librarians, and publishers and other vendors. So we had to move that virtually this year. All the information's on our website, so you can visit some of those video presentations and discussions. Examples of collaboration today: reserves is one area. The bookstores have long supported library reserves, in some cases with financial support, either providing the books or providing funding for reserves. The adoption list information, informing students on the bookstore website that a library reserve might be available. That's something that's been more of a recent trend at more institutions. And now increasingly, there's a lot of discussions about how do we develop a reserve program for digital course materials, and how would those work? And there's different vendors that have proposed some different things, including Ingram VitalSource just came out with a new pilot program. Discovery and adoption, that's an area too where bookstores have shifted from just getting that book list in, no matter if it was on paper form or something else, to more robust systems around helping faculty discover what options are available. And then again, trying to integrate more with library systems and also open educational resources, so that this is presenting information to faculty at the point of researching and then deciding on what materials to use. And there's a lot of activities on open educational resources. I won't go through all of these, but identifying missing adoptions when faculty don't turn in information, joint savings estimates, digital delivery in different formats, managing transactions, because there's a lot of OER resources that are done through course fees. And then obviously print is another area where the bookstores have played a role. Other efforts, and these I think are in some ways the more advanced areas, is matching and sourcing library licensing and course packets. And right now I think for libraries, it's looking at how can we license library content, or how can we obtain content that we can then distribute through the library. At some institutions, they've also looked at, well, what are things that just don't make sense for the library to license, or just not affordable? The ROI is not there. Maybe it's a smaller course. So where are those things that then could be redirected back to the bookstore for course packets or other things where it might make more sense for a student purchase model? Another area is regulatory compliance, because federal regulations address course material, and state laws address course materials. Libraries are not necessarily aware of some of these rules, dealing with financial aid, opt-out policies when you're including content within your tuition and fees. So that's another area. Here's just a couple of quick savings examples. University of Arizona Bookstore and the library have an amazing partnership, and this is some of the results that they have. You also see that at the University of California State University system. The campus activities, most of those are tied to the libraries and OER initiatives. So that's another area. And then here's an example of how you can integrate library reserves into the information the bookstore is providing students so they can see what's available. And then as I mentioned, the types of different programs where we can start integrating library resources, open educational repositories. Where things are kind of muddy, and I hope that's where we'll have time to discuss in the Q&A, is, you know, there continues to be real significant issues with perception of the roles, the mission, the motives of whether it's bookstores or libraries, or how faculty and administrators look at them. And I think from a bookstore perspective, we see course materials as a core academic mission, a service of the bookstore, but sometimes that perception, that view and vision is not necessarily shared by others. So we constantly are kind of dealing with misperceptions in this space. It's only through collaboration and communication that those things are overcome. There's also a lack of understanding or appreciation of the complexity of the adoption process. And I'm going to just quickly show, this is what an adoption process typically looks like. And this is the sort of scheduling of that process, which begins as far out as 6 to 9 months out. So there's a lot of steps involved. So that is not always well understood. We've seen vendors in our community, in communities, kind of looking, how do we sell new things or new projects or initiatives for our customers? And those vendors don't always kind of look at it from the broader institutional interests and perspectives. So there's a lot of work to be done. We've seen some areas where libraries have sort of attacked programs that aren't tied to, that don't necessarily support OER or support commercial materials. Don't have time to get into all of those issues. But there's still a lot of work to be done. And for sake of time, I'm going to switch back to Meg and hope to get into some of these issues during the Q&A and discussion.
Unmute. And thank you, Richard. I'm going to just pull up slides for Jennifer and take it away.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everyone, for having me. If we could go to the next slide. So I think it's always a bit helpful to give some context before getting into the thick of things. As Meg mentioned, my name is Jennifer Chan. I am the Scholarly Communication Librarian at UCLA Library. And I know that all of you play a lot of different roles and wear a number of different hats in your positions. And here are a few of mine that more directly relates to the textbook and course materials discussion. So I actually administer the UCLA Library's Affordable Course Materials Initiative. This is an initiative that we piloted back in 2013, actually, and it underwent an expansion in 2018 to make our resources more discoverable on campus. I also sit on the University of California's Scholarly Transformation and Review team, and that's a UC-wide group that actually looks at and evaluates resources, tools, and products for their transformativeness or transition to more sustainable and potentially more open resources. I was a former member of the Spark Open Education Advisory Group from 2016 to 2020. And finally, I sit on the ASUCLA Course Materials Committee, and ASUCLA stands for the Associated Students of UCLA, and it's actually the organization that runs our campus bookstore. So from my background, you'll probably infer that I am a proponent of open access as well as OERs, open educational resources. So I just want to put that out there. Next slide, please. So I also wanted to give you a little bit of background about our institution, because I know that my comments, while centered on this particular experience, some of it will be different from yours, but I hope that there'll be a lot of takeaways that we can share. So we are a public institution. And our enrollment at UCLA, you can see we're a pretty large campus with our undergraduate students exceeding 31,000. Since about March of this year, largely most of our activity has started to go remote. So our fall quarter was completely remote, except for a few exceptions like clinical and practical courses. We have a really robust offering of more than 130 academic degree programs just for our undergrads. So the library really does strive to try to support as much as possible in collaboration with the bookstore, the needs for instruction, research, and learning. So UCLA Library is an ARL library, and we have in our access more than 12 million both physical and electronic volumes. We have a number of physical libraries on campus, and with our Melville network of UC sister campuses, we have access to approximately 40 million volumes. Next, please. So one of the things in the abstract referred to being gatekeepers of information. One of the libraries that I mentioned on the previous slide was one called Powell Library. And you can see a picture of that here on the left. Powell is actually one of the most visited locations on campus, both from tourists as well as from our undergraduate students. I've been fortunate to work at institutions, both past and present, where the bookstore has actually been operated by a university entity. So I mentioned earlier ASUCLA, the Associated Students of UCLA. They actually run our bookstore, and it is actually the largest student organization in the country. They're also responsible for a few other entities on campus, including our paper, for instance. Next, please. So I think with that in mind, if we can go to the next slide. This setup has really facilitated a spirit of collaboration with the library working really closely with the bookstore. Although we don't take over any of the more traditional bookstore activities, we certainly have worked together and exchanged information. So I think as a result of these experiences, next please, it might be time to really talk about whether or not the role of I think we're out of sync, okay. Of information gatekeeper might be antiquated, and that advances in technology and the resulting increased expectations for information seekers has really been expanded. So with that, I think as someone who's worked in OERs and open access for the better part of almost a decade, I really think that our COVID-19 situation has served to illustrate the necessity for more of our scholarship to be published open access and for more instructional materials to be freely available. When it comes to this question of who should be paying for materials, I think the answer really has to consider the nuances. Resources that might be licensed for the benefit of all potentially could find more sources of support, but models that might charge students upwards of, even in our cases, close to $200 for a course where they can actually only then do homework if they opt into these models. For a public institution like ours, we're not able to responsibly deploy our funds in that way because it would be limited to the students enrolled in the course and therefore be exclusive and not part of the public good. So at our library, we're not only providing information, but we're also creating new resources. At the end of my slides, there's a list of references and resources, including one that I've included for a video game that's an instructional game that we created for Open Access Week. It's a hybrid of Choose Your Own Adventure and 8-Bit Mario. So if anybody's interested in taking a look at that after the presentation, I've had that available. So could we back up a slide, Meg? Meg, could we back up to the slide that says rush to online?
Yes, bear with me a moment. It's I'm having some trouble with my responsiveness on my computer. I'm not sure why. There we go.
Thanks so much.
Sorry about that.
No problem. So for those of you who are supported online instruction, I mentioned access. There was pretty much a mad dash for us to try to secure access to resources online or electronically when instruction sadly had to go remote. So in a lot of cases, this probably seemed or felt like it was something that was happening overnight. What was surprising for us in this scenario was that there were certain cases where we were able to identify either at the library or in conjunction with the bookstore, access to digital materials. Unfortunately, we were unable to actually secure them because we are actually on the quarter system and not a semester system at UCLA. So with that, there were some resources that were locked into certain models that were incompatible with our quarter system. And that unfortunately led to quite a few frustrated instructors. The bookstore was quite frustrated by this as well, and not to mention the library. So this is one thing I think for publishers of content to be really thinking about in terms of when you make your content available through certain platforms. Is it really accessible to folks if it's not something that the business model accommodates, particularly if this is a question of whether or not you're on the quarter system or if you're on a semester system or if your system is just incompatible with a business model, because I think that's not at all what people are thinking about when they put their content into particular platforms for availability. Next slide, please. So as a bookstore and library, I think we have a lot in common. There's a lot of shared motivations. We're certainly all interested in supporting student success. We do offer access to relevant content. And when it comes to questions about course materials or open educational resources, we have an open dialogue back and forth, certainly, to share information about this. And so there's also information sharing between the library and bookstore on course materials assignments, since they're very open with giving us that information when we request it. It's not something that we systematically get prior to every quarter, because there are some instructors who, of course, kind of wait until the last minute, and I think that just really can't be avoided. But largely, if there's a question about what is assigned, that's something that we can get access to. Next, please. So talking just a little bit about not only my library, but also I think this is probably true for a lot of academic libraries, is that we really do at this point prioritize open and affordable resources. We certainly prefer for things to be open access or open education, but if not open, at least affordable. And we do support the creation of OERs at my library through our ACMI program, but there may be other initiatives at your library and also resources that could support that. Next slide, please. But I think what's really key and what stands out here for the library is really about our valuable relationships that we have with faculty, campus, and as well as students and staff. Next, please. So one of these relationships that we have is with our chemistry and biochemistry department, which asks us to consult about a written course materials policy that they wanted to institute. This was actually adopted in August of 2017. And you can see here, I pulled out the 3 key points about this particular policy. And you can see it's really encouraging not only transparency, which I think is pretty important for students who are trying to make a decision about courses, but also affordability. So this information, I think, really is key to better opportunities for engagement, not only with our academic partners, but also with the bookstore and with the students as well. So next, please. Next slide. Thanks so much. So back when we could be on campus, visitors to our library came for our physical spaces, of course, our collections, for research help, for workshops. But I think we also offer experience and expertise, as well as exposure to these complex issues across campus, various departments and academic units. So in our experience, our most successful results have actually been possible when the library has been able to contribute to the solving of these problems in a unique way by offering our perspectives. So I would encourage you to, in your interactions, be not the echo chamber, and to definitely share your experiences and the feedback that you're getting so that not only the bookstore is aware, but also content providers know whether or not you're able to get their materials as intended. And that's my comments. Thanks so much.
Okay. And we're going to kick it over to Lisa. I'm going to switch slides. Bear with me. And Lisa?
Yeah, thanks, Meg. Okay, so as the representative voice of the publisher on this panel, I think I fall into the category of academic partnership referred to in the session title. So the question I asked myself when Meg asked me to participate in this panel was, how can publishers best understand those changing roles and help develop and participate in solutions that successfully serve the needs of the students? Thanks, Meg. So in thinking about how the publisher fits into this dynamic, I started to plot out the broad brush of factors that we can consider when thinking about what a solution might look like. So we know that libraries are working with budgets that are not necessarily positioned to take on the costs involved in textbook delivery to each and every student. But yet this is the sales model that we currently have as the basis of the financial stability of a textbook program. So how do we reconcile that? Also, we know that many libraries still have collection development policies that restrict textbook purchasing. But as publishers, we don't do a particularly good job of communicating how we differentiate between textbooks and course books. Is it just about the pedagogy associated with an undergraduate text? What can we do to help libraries understand our categories? And how can we do a better job of putting books into those categories? And really, I think when it comes down to it, how do we as the publisher do a better job of predicting the adoption trajectory of a course book that might actually start off as a trade book? We also see that the pendulum of perpetual and subscription access is still currently favoring perpetual access in the US market, but is there room for a term-based subscription model in the library collection for course books? And then, you know, what really came to the front of this in this last several months was, how can we solve the immediate need to supply ebooks for reserve shelves as the pandemic continues to limit access to the library print materials? So we see that increasingly blurry line between traditional textbook adoptions and the need to support course use of scholarly books. So we know we need to find solutions that facilitate the academic freedom of the faculty to make their own book selections. But does that necessarily mean that an ebook collection of course books licensed by the library can't also support those educational resource needs? With enrollment fluctuations and the length of time that a student might need access to a particular book varying, can an enrollment-based model fit into a library collection? And if it did, would this then give the publishers the repeat annual revenue that we need in order to maintain an active textbook program? So when it comes down to it, the learning experience that the students and the faculty are expecting from an ebook platform could potentially differ between a scholarly, a course book, and a textbook. So is it just about the content, as we sometimes see the need coming from the library? Or are there necessary functionalities that need to be made available in a publisher platform or an aggregated platform to support the note sharing, class collaboration, and integration for the LMS? And Meg, if you could just click. And then of course, there's really everything else. When we talk about student affordability, we also have to pay close attention to our authors in this solution. one of the most common email queries I get from editors at OUP is how to reply to an author who discovers that her book, much to her dismay, is being made available for free to the students through the library. This impression in itself becomes an obstacle to how we create the right collaborative partnership. So can we find a solution with the right mix of flexible components to serve all involved? Meg? So with apologies for my very rudimentary visuals, it occurred to me that the current dynamic looks something like this. We as the publisher published a book. The student might find that book at the campus bookstore, at the library, through another purchase or retail provider, or perhaps the book has been made available to them through an IA program. But these all exist as very binary relationships. These players and options coexist socially distanced. Each are aware of each other. Maybe they're bumping elbows, but they're certainly not hugging. And Meg, next slide, Meg. Uh-oh. Did Meg drop out?
It looks like she might have.
Ah. Is Claire able to give me control?
Hi, yes, Lisa, you can share on your own. I don't need to give you control, just the bottom of the button.
I will jump into that, and I will have to change my presentation. Hold on, folks. And now this will be me winging it because I can't see my notes. So right now we have a very, as I said, we have a very binary relationship between the book and those distribution outlets. But what if we blurred the lines a little bit? What if the faculty actually shared their reading lists with both the bookstore and the library, so that the library could immediately gain access to an ebook for the reserve room, while the bookstore was also able to put in individual print copies for those students who still like to have their individual copy. What if the faculty—
Sorry to interrupt. Are you, you're not sharing currently? Do you?
Oh gosh, I'm sorry. I thought I was. Let me try that again. Share.
There you go.
All right. Got it?
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, everybody. What if the student materials fees that would normally go into an IA program actually got directed to the library for the library to manage the IA program? So how do we think about different ways of using these four previously sort of fairly disparate and discrete distribution channels to come up with a collaborative, strategic solution to help the student get access to the bookstore, to the book rather? How do we create a mix and a blended model that really helps ultimately the student, but allows for recognition that there are multiple ways for those students to access that content? So at OUP, we've done a little bit of blurring of the lines ourselves. We had to go through some kind of a risk assessment to understand the continuum of what we identified as low-risk titles and high-risk titles. In doing that analysis, we were very quickly able to see that many of the books that an editor might have identified as an adoptable title actually did not perform in such a way that making the title available through a different collection of options would actually impinge on that revenue stream. So that allowed us to open up our monographs and our scholarly titles and our trade books to more of the open channels, whether it's through our own platform, through aggregator platforms, through the higher ed rental models as well. So that really allowed us to push more content into the various different channels we have to make the books available to all of the players in the market. We then knew that we had some higher risk course books, and we thought to ourselves, those are books that we know we still have student adoptions on, but could we also put together a collection that the library could subscribe to, perhaps position as an educational resource for the institution, but do things like restrict the PDF downloads so that it really was more of a library resource and rather than a student use resource. We then came to our high risk titles where this really became our core textbooks. OUP is certainly an academic scholarly publisher with a core higher ed program. And that higher ed program is based on a direct to student repeatable annual revenue model. So we needed to make sure that there was enough of a balance between how these titles are made available, recognizing the need for libraries to also be able to provide access. So we do make these titles available on a title by title basis, but they're still driven by models that are about the student enrollment numbers. And similarly with the inclusive access, this is really where we see the most opportunity, but the most protective opportunity for those high-risk titles, which really rely on that predictable revenue for the maintenance of the core textbook market. And with that, I see that Meg has joined us, and I share our questions, thoughts, and ideas slide. So thank you very much.
Lisa and panel, sorry about that. Of course, anything that can go wrong will go wrong because it's 2020. My router went down on me. So, but I'm back. So let's see, I can start my video too here. So I think one of the things I'd like to ask the panel, and this was addressed, and thank you all for your comments too. What is, in your opinion, I'll take one from the audience, what is the best way to view the definition of a textbook in today's climate? And Lisa touched on the difficulties here. As a vendor, many of our academic books are used as textbooks and courses, but are not defined as textbooks by many publishers. This can be a confusing conversation between libraries, faculty, and bookstores. Anyone? Lisa, you mentioned that. Richard?
Yep. Yeah, I'd be happy to just take a quick.
Or do you want to chime in? Is there some sort of metaphor, or do we need to classify materials in that way? It's a good question.
Well, and in my space, we do have to, because often this is a heavily regulated space. We have the Higher Education Act, the Higher Education Opportunity Act of 2008, created requirements of all institutions of higher education that accept Title IV funds, which include Pell Grants, student loans, federal student loans. And those laws all have specific types of definitions for course materials or textbooks. Generally, from our area, we try to avoid using the term textbooks anymore. We do refer to things as course materials. Certainly from just the publishing side of things, we recognize that many titles that are being adopted or content is being adopted are trade books or textbooks or software. So we use a pretty broad definition that includes things that basically faculty are designating for the student to acquire as required or recommended. And specifically, we look at it as content. In addition to content, there's obviously a lot of other things that students also need to have to complete coursework, including often certain supplies, equipment, technology. So those things also come into it. But access codes, which are not really a product. They're just a mechanism to get to a product or a service or platform, is another thing that's often discussed.
Lisa, do you want to jump in on that since you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I just kind of expand upon my earlier comments, and I think it's, it's the difference of being able to do it in advance of publication versus knowing how the book performs once it's available in the market. And for us, that's one of the biggest challenges, because we want to be able to put the book in the appropriate channels and out in the appropriate models as soon as the book is published. It's fine to do a backlist project and push more of this content out retrospectively, but to be able to predict how a book is going to perform, there is a very big range, and trying to understand what the factors are within the non-core undergraduate textbook market kind of remains a challenge. I think we all have to deal with the fact that, if so, especially let's say so many of the OUP books can be purchased as what a library would think of as a monograph, right? Or a scholarly book. And yet there's a point at which we say, no, that's actually going to be used as a course book, so it's going to be withheld from your approval plans. That doesn't work for anybody, and we know that.
Another question, or Jennifer, do you want to weigh in on that? Or
Well, I think that last point that Lisa made is probably pretty key, which is that, if it is labeled as a textbook, institutions like mine, the library, most likely can't have access to this, or won't be able to have access either directly through the approval plan, or perhaps even as a title basis may not be able to license those titles. So whether or not something is classified as a textbook, I know it's a complex calculation for the publisher to make, but for my institution, generally speaking, I would say that for the most part, we're not able to license or acquire something that's marketed as technically a textbook.
Right. Well, and I think because formerly those business models were really predicated on very specific economic models, and Lisa again made reference to this. Those individual student textbooks, there's a certain amount of revenue that has traditionally been driven there, and the two different use cases. And again, Lisa said it very well, those lines are really blurring. And I think that has to do not only with how publishers are publishing content, but also how curriculum is being developed, right? So,
absolutely. Yeah,
so,
just to add to that, I would definitely say for us, there's many courses where there is a core textbook, but there's a lot of course materials also that the instructor has assigned to it. And those can be a variety of different formats and different types of materials. So whether or not we're looking just strictly at the traditional textbook for instruction these days, I think that definition is really expanded.
Yeah, true. So another question from the audience here. What is IA, which I'm going to assume that acronym in this, given our discussion, is included access, and what is it? Any of our panelists want to dive in first? Everybody's nodding away.
Yeah, I'll take a quick stab. I think a lot of people, it's many different things, but in a nutshell, it's when course materials are provided to students in a way that's not a self-procurement model. So IA, inclusive access, whatever the marketing name of it is, it's nothing. It's not really a new concept. There are institutions of higher education that have been providing course materials through a course fee for more than 100 years. Textbook rental type programs have existed on campuses in Wisconsin, Illinois, North Carolina, Missouri for more than 100 years. So, the school is providing all the materials. They're integrated, whether into tuition fees or some kind of segregated charge. The new models today are mostly focused on digital. They can be a school-wide program. They can be individual courses. Because of federal financial aid regulations, we have provisions for students' ability to opt out of programs, not opt out of the required materials. That hasn't changed. That's still the faculty's prerogative. But essentially, it's a bulk purchasing negotiation discount, which also libraries do through licensing of materials with publishers. So there's lots of different regulations and issues that are tied to these types of programs, but that's just the gist of it is that the institution's negotiating or finding a way to reduce the costs in exchange, in the case for publishers, for at least for digital, a higher sell-through, and then the process of how students pay. Typically, most models today for inclusive access, the student has free access to the material from the point of registration or 2 weeks before the term until the ad drop date. And so they're not charged until after that ad drop date, at which point then they're billed. So those are some of the different types of models, but there's many different approaches to this. And one of the things that's sort of frustrating in my area is that many libraries do these programs, don't recognize that they're doing them. And yet there is a federal financial aid compliance regulations that they may not be aware of that they're supposed to be doing.
Right.
And that's where you get into the blended issues of definitions and where some of these things occur.
So I'm going to give Lisa, we're a little over time. Lisa or Jennifer, is there anything quickly you want to add before we wrap up?
No, I mean, I would think, I think the inclusive access discussion is one where thinking for the publisher, where our direct relationship for licensing for access within the institution has always gone through the library. And now with IA, it being in multiple other locations or sitting with multiple other departments, whether it's the provost, and sometimes the library, but not always the library, just starts to add to a complexity of the conversation. And, you know, from where I sit, sometimes I think, but we already have these kind of conversations with the library. The only obstacle here is the funding. And, you know, I think that's where there's still so much up in the air to talk about, to figure out a way that all the parties can find the right solution.
And Jennifer, will give you the last word.
Right. So we don't do IA at UCLA Library. It's certainly one of the potential models for acquisition at the bookstore. One of the issues that I think folks really don't consider with IA is the fact that, you know, it's a financial decision that's being made by the instructor on behalf of the student. It's not so much a content decision because the content now is being locked into a restrictive format. And I think that is certainly an issue to think about. And in the anecdotes that we have experienced for online transition at UCLA, at least, even when the bookstore wanted to negotiate the potential for an IA access, we were unable to do so because of restrictions to this particular business model. So I think IA is not necessarily more inclusive. In fact, for students who have affordability issues, it can be really a challenge between whether, you know, they want to continue to being able to afford food, or if they're going to be able to pay to do homework to get graded for their courses. So I think there's a lot of complexity with IA, and I certainly can see pros and cons on both sides, but it is certainly different from the models that we have at the library that we would employ.
Yeah, just real fast, I mean, IA doesn't necessarily have anything to do with whether you have homework assignments or using access codes. That's still the prerogative of the faculty assigning what resources and tools that they need for student to have. So it's really more about the payment process, the price, the cost, but it doesn't necessarily have anything directly to do with, you know, an access code requirement for students to have a certain platform or software to complete homework. That can still exist, whether it's part of an inclusive access program or part of digital, you know, an item that the professor is indicating is required to complete the class. So certainly My Math Lab and other types of products existed before inclusive access programs and exist.
So
on campuses that don't.
I'm sorry to cut you off, Richard. We're a little bit over time.
I'll let you go. Yep.
But I do think just that's part of the reason we're having this session is these models continue to evolve. And I think, the common goal that you heard from all of our panelists is there is an interest in making sure that the scholarly community has the materials they need, those students have the materials they need to get their best outcomes. So I think we still have lots of work to do, but these conversations will certainly continue. So thanks so much for joining today. I apologize for my technical difficulties, and hopefully that will be the worst thing that happens to any of us today. Thanks to our panelists. Wonderful job. Appreciate your time.
Thank
You well.
you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.